disappointed looking back over my life. I don't think any women could ever complain that I sexually harassed them or attacked them at a drunken party or anything.
So you're disappointed about that?
Well, I mean, it looks like all of the super male role models are, so what that tells me is I'm nowhere close to any of those super male role models. I'm not a billionaire. I'm not the kind of movie maker that...
You're not?
No.
What?
I'm not America's dad.
What? No, you're not like, what's his face part out?
Bill Cosby. Oh my
Cosby.
goodness. 60 women complained about him.
That's a lot of women. You need to ask yourself something.
What I don't understand is why did these women wait until now?
There's a sea change in our attitude about the proper behavior of
I understand that,
males. Although I have to say, if you're 15 and you're drunk,
and you're at a party you should not be at in the first place.
Yeah, up in the boys' bedroom.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
I hope
circumstances.
I didn't watch it. I didn't
party?
watch it. I know that the court thing.
Make good decisions.
The committee interview of Dr. Ford was supposed to occur today, along with Brett Kavanaugh.
Well, here's the thing: they already got political ads.
I haven't watched it either. I've been.
But I didn't watch it. I'm also
damage
curious
today.
about Trump's interview with Rosenstein, because that's curious. I don't think Rosenstein will be fired because Trump now has him by the
balls.
The you don't have the
peanuts.
Okay, you shut it
I picture the skeleton in the Monty Python, death. Where he says,
oh God, I love Monty Python.
Americans, you don't have the balls to, and he's got these great big bony fingers. So, okay. So that's all happening today. So we live in exciting time.
We live a life on the edge, man. It's great.
Although I think people have always thought they lived in exciting times and always lived life on the edge. I mean, nuclear destruction. That was when I was a kid. Practice getting under our wooden desks. Really
What's that gonna do?
That was going to save us.
Nothing.
Huh?
They're going to find your singed ashes underneath the desk so they can account for you. So yeah, he was sitting there, or whoever it was sitting there. If the building at all is still up around.
Where would be a good place to actually put this so that it could give people who aren't here, that are counting on the video, an opportunity to see here? It won't help them smell or taste. That's true.
No,
Well,
maybe future technology will do that.
We're going to go. Yeah, I've been to movies in special theaters where they had the seats move, and they had these little spritzer devices underneath the seats that would change the smell in the air. Yes.
I don't know what movie theater I was in, but I remember we were watching one of the SpongeBob movies, and there was a rat that ran across the screen or something, and they had something like a rat tail that went underneath the seat and touched everybody's legs, and so everybody screamed all at once and pulled their leg. It was the freakiest thing.
Yeah, no thanks.
No. Not a fan.
So I don't know that you've ever. That'll be enough. 4 minutes is enough. That's actually a whole lot. That sounds awful.
The speakers aren't too great.
Is it the speakers or is it? is of the recording. I suspect That's a little better. I don't need it that. I don't know. How many of you have heard of Rousseau before? You at least have heard of him, right?
Yeah.
Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Yes.
Some of the more famous things. I can just pull up. I was surprised, even my friend Rick Goodfellow, who owns KLEF, one Wednesday evening we were talking and I mentioned Rousseau's opera and he looked at me and said, "Rousseau, the philosopher?" I said, "Yes." He said, "He never wrote an opera."
Yeah, I did.
I said, yes, he did. In fact, I heard it on your radio station." And he said, "No, and he actually, I don't think we actually bet money or something, but he went and checked with the guy who plays the Saturday Night at the Opera, Mike Youngrice, who was the one that he makes the selections for Saturday night at 8 o'clock when he plays an opera. And yes, he played Rousseau's Le Devin du Village, or however you say it.
That's pretty good.
And so, he came back the next Wednesday and ate crow, which, no, he didn't actually eat a blackbird, but that's an expression that means he agreed. "Oh, you were right."
I knew I was right.
Yeah. But I have to admit, the reason I knew that there was an opera by Rousseau was because Mike Youngrice played it on the radio, and I listened to it, with absolute, horror, because, I suppose it was popular at the time. It was okay. It was, for the day. But he was, I think, disappointed in his success, even though it was okay. He was kind of disappointed, though, because he wrote to Voltaire. You've heard of Voltaire, right? So he wrote to Voltaire, who we should also take a look at here. Voltaire. Because he's also a official philosopher. I mean, he's one of the French thinkers. Of course, he's much more famous for his literature.
I love these guys in wigs.
I understand the main reason they wore those wigs, and they wear wigs, was because they shaved their heads, so they had less of a lice problem.
Yeah.
But the wigs were the ones that would spread the lice, right?
They also often had little dogs, lap dogs. And the main reason for that, especially women would have these little fluffy dogs. And the main reason they had them and kept them in their laps was because the lice would prioritize. The dog was more interesting than the person.
Oh, that's shitty.
That's cool.
And so by having a little lap dog, you had less lice on you. So it's kind of interesting. We still have infestations of lice and bed bugs and things. We're, pretty fortunate because Alaska has less of that than the lower 48. Bugs in general, most of the bugs we have are not serious as far as, except the mosquito, the state bird. Mosquito.
I thought that was a target, Will Target.
Officially, yes,
No.
but if you're a tourist, you see all the postcards, the state bird, and it's the Z, mosquito. Okay, so Voltaire, Rousseau writes to Voltaire, and you could read their letters. There's a lot of their letters that have been preserved and are on the internet, so you could just look them up. And there's actually people that will argue over their relationship. I read them, at least some of them, and I was absolutely convinced these guys are good friends. A lot of people think they hated one another because they said mean things to one another. But the way I read what I read, the mean things they were saying to one another were the kind of mean things that friends say to one another.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
They're trying to get each other's goat.
Yeah, well, you know, they clearly like one another enough because they write enough to one another and they keep saying nasty things back to one another of the sort that just tells you these guys enjoy one another's company. And Voltaire is the older or more experienced, I think, when we got here. So he's 1694 to May 1778. And Rousseau is notice 1712. So there's quite a few years that gives Rousseau youth compared to Voltaire. And so he writes to Voltaire, he says, how do you become famous? Because he wants to become famous, well known, and the opera didn't do it for him. It was okay, but it was no world, idol. Well, no one could quite do that back then, of course. You had TV, etc. So Voltaire writes back, says, write books that say just the opposite of what everybody believes. Now, that, I think, is the key to understanding what Rousseau then would go and do. He would write books that would argue for just the opposite of what everybody believed. So, Emile, for example,
right underneath Julie.
It's rated. Oh, there it is. Okay, so this is an example, right? You can look at all of them, and they go, the social contract. These are all. Think about it. Write just the opposite of what everyone else believes. Right? So Emile is about education, the best education. As far as he's concerned, the best education is no education. Because education screws you up. So if what you want is the best education, don't put the kid in school. Let the kid just run wild, basically. And the ones that survive, because he doesn't mean just, give it breakfast each day and then let it go out to play. And no, his idea is you have the child, it's big enough to walk, you kick it out into the street. Let it survive on its own.
It's legit.
I mean, it would learn some things.
Well, yeah, and then the ones that survive,
come
back, and they begin asking you questions. So, like, as you're walking along,
why?
Say, why
am
some
I
of
out here
those
on this
trees
street?
turn yellow while other ones are still green? In other words, it's student-centered education. It's the student that prompts the questions, right? And your responses then are aimed at the student, right? So instead of, these are the things everybody has to know by the time you're 10, or 15, or 100, whatever, right? Instead of that, you just let the child come to you with the questions as they arise, naturally, right? And then you answer the child's questions, right? So it's student-centered. By the way, we still use that expression.
So what schools of education are big on student-centered?
This one.
This one?
This one.
Yeah, well, I guess this would be...
Emile is required reading for a student of education here in various, degree
Got it.
things. And the idea is everyone's like, oh, this is great stuff. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, this is basically a ruse, a ploy to become famous by saying just the opposite of what everyone knows to be true. So this is ridiculous, basically, and yet everyone reads it and is like, oh, this is the way we've got to teach. How did this happen? How did
This is profound.
That started in the 60s.
well this is he becomes famous back then.
What,
Right?
1760s?
But as far as American education, it started in the 60s.
This is not my John Dewey.
Noah Webster, right?
I'm not that familiar with Webster Dewey, other than the dictionary.
Well, because Webster did all of the first editions of the spellers and stuff for all the primary schools in like the
Right.
early
Right, but
1800s.
the John Dewey as an American philosopher,
But he was
education,
late 19th century, right?
1890s
Yeah.
was some of his so he was teaching at the University of Michigan, University of Minnesota, back at the University of Michigan, then the University of Chicago. At the University of Chicago, Dewey developed what was called the Activity School. Also invented a thing called the PTA, Parent Teachers Association, because the idea was the parents should be involved in the students' education. But it was called the Activity School or the Laboratory School, where you first off separate students by their age groups and abilities, so that you're teaching them things specific to their next logical step, as opposed to having a room full of everybody that is in town that's still in school. With all the various ages and teaching the capitals of the states, with the ruler and just rote memorization. Right? Instead, the Activity School is psychologically aimed at the learning level of the student and gives them problems that then they have to solve. But the problems you give to them are aimed at their level so that they're hard enough for them to have to really think, but at the same time that they can solve it, right? And then you give them another problem, etc. So what you're doing is teaching the child to think. That was the goal, right?
You're avoiding the deer in the headlights.
Yeah. Well,
I'm sorry.
and that influenced our educational system plus the world, really, because other countries got interested in Dewey's theory of education, which was based on Hegel's philosophy. Dewey was a Hegelian.
Really?
And what you end up with is this dialectical process,
Yeah,
right?
right.
The theory of inquiry as it develops, right? You have a problem, come up with, the potential
right.
solution, you have a hypothesis, you test your hypothesis.
Synthesis.
If it doesn't work, you reevaluate, so you get this dialectical process, which is how we think, and that's how we should teach, instead of rote learning. It was a big fight, actually, at the University of Chicago. Hutchinson, Maynard Hutchinson, was it Maynard Hutchinson, who produced the great books. So this is like about this long, this table length long, of great big ugly boring tomes with no pictures and double columned print of all the great books that you needed to learn to be an educated person.
Yeah.
Educated man, actually, at the time, right? But so Dewey transforms our educational system and it's student-centered, but he's certainly aware of Rousseau and that idea. But So Rousseau, of course, is prior to, he dies in 78. Right? Remember our easy to remember date from the great year of Pinot Noir is 1776. Right? It is also the year that David Hume dies, because he had too much Pinot Noir that year. No, I don't. It was gout killed
That sucks.
David Hume. Yeah.
Too much pork, huh?
You would think after
Eating.
all the modern science that disease would be gone, but I have family members that have gout.
My dad gets gout.
Richard Nixon had gout. President Nixon. First president I ever voted for. Samuel Johnson, Dr. Samuel Johnson, who was the one that made Shakespeare famous, and also wrote a dictionary of sorts. One of the first, was did die of fluids. It might not be gout, but he had excessive fluids in his body, and they even got into his legs. And he asked the doctor to stab his legs to drain the fluid.
Huh.
The doctor was hesitant to just kind of slice the skin a little bit, and Johnson was upset with him that he didn't do a good enough job, so he took the scissors from a drawer and stabbed his legs to try to drain them.
You have staph infection?
And how'd that go over?
A lot of blood. No, that's not necessarily fluid. This is true. I'm not lying about it.
I do
You know,
not
the
want to
internet-
see any like photos or like.
Get pimple popping videos on YouTube.
Okay, those are fine. That's different. Okay. But
Especially when they blow the pictures up.
I love.
Make it
They're
look like
relaxing to
they're
watch.
Yes.
Like, but like, this is way different. This is some, like, man, like, just like, I hate all the fluids in my legs.
Oh, that guy. I've seen that. I know that guy.
He's a me. Of course, it would be this guy.
Yeah, I know, right? It would be this guy. Now we know why he's.
I went. This is why I shouldn't be in school. Oh God.
So here, this time he was, what's that? Oh,
What?
wonderful.
That's
I
cool.
wanted to see
What
that.
the hell is
He
that?
had surgery for gout.
It looks like Venom with a mustache.
He was confined to his room, traveled to Oxford. When his physician Thomas Warren visited and asked him if he burst out, "No, sir, you cannot conceive." So, well, you can look through it.
Dang.
I'm sure I've read it about him. How you know how that sort of thing sticks in your head. But so, Emile, education, just the opposite of what we expect. The social contract. Get back to the social contract. So the social contract. This is pretty significant because you all know that 1789, the French had a revolution. Let's go do that.
Yeah, they really did. They kind of botched that one.
Robespierre would be one of the ones that we can tie into on this. There's some good biographies of Robespierre, by the way. I actually started reading one once and got up. It was interesting, but I had other things I was trying to keep up with, and so once it was due at the library, I took it back and I never finished. Robespierre famously was kind of like the head of the whatever government they ended up with. It wasn't very good, but it mostly killed people and used the guillotine that's pretty famous. And eventually, by the way, they were overthrown, and the same instrument was used on Robespierre. So he guillotined a lot of people, and the guillotine chopped his head off too, right? OC, right? He was also well, so the social contract, according to Rousseau, is different than Locke, different than Hobbes, and again, the difference is in the approach to the state of nature. Remember, Hobbes gives us a state of nature that's brutal, nasty, short, miserable, dog eat dog, all that. But we create a social contract in order to have order and security, and so it should be a monarchy because that way we're not going to have any fighting. Locke says, the heck with that, we want a social contract where the king has to do his job or we throw him out, right? And notice that ties in beautifully with precisely what William of Orange was doing, throwing out James, and because James wasn't doing his job. He hadn't died or anything, but the people didn't like him, or at least enough people didn't like him that they invited William of Orange, who was a legitimate heir as well, cousin, something like that. But for Locke, the state of nature that drives us to have this social contract is a family love affair. Everyone's all lovey-dovey and cares for one another, so it's not dog eat dog, and everything. But the problem is it gets too big and complex and messy, and mom can't rule things very well anymore. So we have to come up with rules. And by the way, we can change the rules, because if the rules don't work, and so on. But we also need checks and balances. Balances are like scales that you can put things on to see how things weigh, and checks are things you write in order to pay your bill. No, I'm totally joking. That's not what checks and balances are. What are checks and balances? You have a couple of, yes, right? You have
mutual blackmail. I don't know, what do you want to call it?
Yeah, it's like there's not one person controlling everything. There's multiple
exactly.
people controlling different things that check each other.
Exactly. And you were supposed to laugh hysterically when I said balances and checks. No, that's totally not.
So funny. I can't
I really, what gets into me when I come up with this crap? I don't know. But, terrible jokes. I've never tried that joke before. I just spur of the moment.
You're probably the one professor that I have that has terrible dad jokes, and you're not afraid to say them all the time. So good job. Kudos to you.
I have a lot more sitting on my dining room table at the moment.
Sitting
that
on
I haven't. Yes, but I haven't read them yet.
Like metaphorically or like literally?
The Legion magazine. Not foreign. I was never in the foreign. Whatever. I get a magazine, the Legionnaire magazine, whatever. And the only part of it I ever read is the very last page that has a whole bunch of absolutely dead kind of jokes and dumb things.
Interesting.
So checks and balances. And the reason for the checks and balances, says Locke, is because, of course, everyone has to do their job, and that includes the king. So if the king isn't doing his job, the people have the right to ask, why is this smoke pouring out of, I guess it was a car, so never mind.
Oh, dang.
But checks and balances, so if the king isn't doing legitimate work and satisfying everyone, then somebody else has the right to criticize and perhaps even throw the bum out. And so the parliament gets that job. And the parliament has to have checks and balances too, and that would turn out to be the king. So the two of them have mutual overlapping requirements of making sure one or the other is behaved, but also the parliament is elected. Now it depends, especially in England, they have the House of Lords who are there for life, depending on their inheritance of a nobility status, and then those that are elected by the community at large, and those are like Boris Johnson, for example. And even though he gets other jobs, he's still essentially in that parliament, member of parliament, an MP, right? So that's kind of the British model, and that was Locke was pretty much the one that establishes that. By the way, there is a judiciary. I forgot that was even running.
It was really relaxing. Can we put some more on?
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh, okay. Never mind then.
I acted
Hopes
too
and
quickly.
dreams smashed.
We cannot smash your dreams. We have to.
Aw, what a nice
We have to go
sir.
and.
Thank you, sir. I'm sorry. Yes. No, it was really nice. I think we should always have like classical music in the background of class.
Mozart. Yeah. Just,
That's very appropriate, by the way.
this is
Same
pretty
time,
17.
same time,
This is
yeah.
pretty 1770s,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty.
Or
right.
1790.
It's like the Bieber of his day.
Stop. Get out.
Oh, Justin Bieber?
Oh my god!
Okay, I get it.
Okay, I was on the same line he was.
Oh
I
my
was
God.
thinking leave it to Beaver, you know.
Because I
That's
heard you say
hilarious.
Beaver.
No.
No, Bieber.
Yeah, Bieber.
The like kid that smells like a chick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Either's wrong, I guess.
Okay, so
Anyway,
It's the right answer, man.
His music's a little better now.
a little bit.
A little better. He
Because
doesn't sound like
he-
a girl
his,
anymore.
Yeah, his voice dropped.
so now we have a nice background.
Yes.
So
it's
your
not-
hopes are not dashed.
I
Thank
think
you so
Mozart
much.
just needs like DJ Khaled on it,
You
another
know?
one.
Yeah.
He wasn't actually that popular compared to a few other composers in his day.
No, I mean, I'm sure he was what he
Right.
was in
He
Austria.
was what he was.
He was kind of a star because at 4 years old he was playing at parties and stuff.
Yeah,
playing
I
music,
know that
and everybody.
part of it.
They like put him up on a chair and he would play the violin or the piano.
Kind of like
He
a
started
savant.
composing his own music. I
He wasn't like all that mentally
argue
stable.
that it was actually his older sister that composed some of his early music, or at least helped him.
Yeah.
You know, but you know, it was that star kind of thing. When I listened to a contemporary of his who was older, Salieri,
Mm-hmm.
and Rick plays a lot of Salieri on KLEF. It always strikes me that a main difference between Salieri's music and Mozart's music is that Mozart uses the whole orchestra in a kind of a counter melodic effort, so that da da da, you know, so
Yeah.
so you get like the melody is constructed by the orchestra as a whole, whereas Salieri has the melody here, and in the background you have strings going, dun, 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 you know. So in other words, there's a significant
So you think
difference in the way the whole orchestra is used.
so would you say Mozart's stuff's almost more like polyphonic or like?
It's definitely more complex,
Yeah.
but achieves results that are significantly better.
Because I noticed he kind of mixes like you're saying, instead of just using one voice for the melody, he lets it interplay with all the different.
Yeah, you get kind of an interesting, and Beethoven picks that up and continues it on. In fact, some of Mozart's later works, like the Jupiter Symphony, sound an awful lot like Beethoven symphonies.
Mhm.
So there's all sorts of interesting stuff there. But so the French are going to base their revolution on his theory of the state of nature. And unlike Locke, big happy family that gets too complex and so we need to come up with contracts, checks and balances, etc., Rousseau argues that man in the state of nature is like in paradise. What screws people up and makes life horrible is society.
Right.
So the rules and
So
the
let's guillotine everybody.
other people literally are what screw life up for everybody.
That's a pretty French idea. Yeah.
It's a Rousseau idea. I wouldn't say it's French. It becomes French
Yeah.
to the extent that Rousseau is influential.
Sartre, right?
But you get,
How is other people?
well, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
something about being
No
French.
exit.
I mean,
Yeah,
life's
the-
pretty bad
yeah.
over there.
I never put that together really with Rousseau, but you're right. But if you think about this, Voltaire is still having that influence on Rousseau because common sense tells you that you absolutely need society. I mean, Aristotle on what we are zoon politikon, the political animal, the social animal. We need stories like Romulus and Remus being raised by a wolf, right? They're just nonsense. Although occasionally you hear odd things about a feral child growing up in India or something. Why they all grow up in India when they're like that. But yeah, we need mom and dad, or at least mom, in order to survive until we can move, things of that sort.
But Rousseau thinks that the 5-year-old is sort of like the ideal
Well,
human.
he's still doing what Voltaire suggested, and he's realized by now that this works. You say just
So
the
what?
opposite of what everybody believes is the case. What makes people horrible? Society makes people horrible. And it's like, yeah, you're right.
That's where all the vices come from.
And so the best kind of social contract is the minimalist, government whatsoever. It's absolutely a vice. The more government you have, the worse things get. And so the best thing to do is have no government, or if you have to, at least any rules that anyone comes up with have to be rules that everyone agrees to.
Yeah. That's another big
Have you
problem.
ever seen 100 people in one room all agree to anything? It's impossible.
How big's the...
There's
That
lots
is
of
a
people in there.
good
Yeah,
question.
well, we've had some 100 people in a small enough room
They
that
might all agree what room they're in.
it's not going to be
Maybe.
That's a good point.
it's not going to be very good.
I'm the only one here.
They might agree to
None
this
of you
round.
exist.
You're all
It's a small
you're all
room.
my personalities.
But that's what happened to the revolution is in France, was that the form of government that they agreed to was based on this theory, and that everyone has to agree to any of the rules, and they never ended up. So it devolved.
Well, I mean, they found a pretty cool way to get rid of the people that didn't agree.
Yeah, well, but the thing is, some of the people that they got rid of were actually part of their own revolution, and a lot of
Agreeing too hard.
the intelligentsia. I mean, chopping the head off of a mathematician because he was smart.
You're too smart. You can't.
Yeah,
Sorry, not
you're
here.
way smarter than the rest of us. We're chopping your
You're
head
lucky
off.
your head still fits through the hole.
But they were educated. Educated usually meant they were upper class. Upper class meant that, hey, we're going to kill you.
Yeah.
So
They
they ended
take
up
all your
killing.
stuff.
They ended up killing a lot of individuals that were really important to the infrastructure and to So it's almost a famous line. They were the best of times. They were the worst of times. So Charles Dickens starts A Tale of Two Cities, London and Paris, right? And the best of times is London. They were having a great time at the time. Meanwhile, in Paris, they're screwing everybody. basically, with the guillotine and other, yeah, and by the way, it means everybody's starving, because no one's getting any work done, all the upheaval in the way everything was run.
That sounds great.
Totally not like France today.
Jeez.
No, not really. I mean, because really they're much better off.
Oh, they're
they
doing
don't.
fine, I mean-
They don't chop people's heads off today.
No.
And the ownership of property is pretty clear. They've gone back to that. The church is allowed back. You're allowed to be a Catholic there. In fact, they still fund the Catholic Church there because no one else does, except tourists, from what I hear. I think we talked about that, right? So this is kind of amazing. The social contract. So when I think of them, I think of this guy as taking advantage of people by deliberately writing just the opposite of what everyone thinks. That they were in the state of nature. Let us then admit that force does not create right, and that we are obliged to obey only legitimate powers. There are some things, this is going to be very influential. Hegel's going to be influenced by Rousseau. And a lot of this, for example, the church, all this time, argued that your soul is the most important thing, and that in order to protect your soul from corruption, you have to keep it unattached to the physical world of the body, because the body will help corrupt the soul by engaging in fun things for the body, like eating, sex, pleasurable things like the comfy chair, for example. Did I ask you guys about the comfy chair?
I love a comfy chair.
The comfy chair? I didn't mention the comfy chair.
No, but it sounds great right about now.
There's a comfy chair back here.
That's not the kind of comfy I'm
Not the
looking
kind.
for. The kind of chair I'm looking for is really like a king size, like Tempur-Pedic bed. To be honest. Oh God, I think you showed this to the last class. You never seen this again. God damn it.
This looks legit.
You might want to check it.
Oh, I had turned the music down a little bit, so it was just in the background.
You are accused of heresy on 3 counts. Heresy by thought, heresy by word, heresy by deed, and heresy by action. 4 counts. Do you confess?
I don't understand what I'm accused of.
Then we shall make you understand. Biggles. Bench. The cushions. Carry on. Now, all men, you have one last chance. Confess the heinous sin of heresy. Reject the works of the other. 2 last chances. And you shall be free. 3 last chances. You have 3 last chances. The nature which I have divulged in my previous utterance.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Right! Then that's the way you want it. Cardinal. Poker. With the soft cushion. Confess! 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 Have you got all the stuffing up on end? Yes, Lord. It is made of harder stuff. Cardinal Fang. Fetch the comfy chair. The comfy chair? So, you think you are strong because you can survive the soft cushions? Well, we shall see. Biggles, put her in the comfy chair. Now, you will stay in the comfy chair until lunchtime with only a cup of coffee at 11. Yes, Lord. I think. I suppose it may be worth my shopping along. Confess. 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 I confess.
the comfy chair.
Right.
So the joke here, of course, and I suppose you have to be Church of England to understand the Monty Python, and their play on this.
You don't have to understand.
But the idea, of course, the Spanish Inquisition was famous for torturing people.
Yep.
But if you think of it, the church believed. That's too loud. The church believed that the main thing in your life that needed to be protected was the soul, and the way your soul is protected is by treating the body like crap, beating it. You could have your own whip. By the way, this is not just the Catholic Church. Notice that there are lots of cities where the men on certain holidays will march about together beating themselves until they're bloody, showing their soul's dominance over their body. Yes? You've seen this? Yes? This happens? The Catholic Church was the same way. The idea is, you make it some. By the way, the Protestants, in many respects, were also this way, at least initially. So it's not just the priests that have to beat themselves into submission. The body, right? The same thing applies to raising children, right? Spare the rod,
Spoil the child.
spoil the child, right? And that's because it's mind over matter, right? The body wants to just have fun and do whatever, but your mind is going to be like a steel control over that. So you wear tight, stiff collars and ties and shave your face and just beat your body to death in order to show it who's boss, right? Because you want to keep the soul protected, and so the comfy chair is like. That should be the ultimate punishment, because that any comfort is going to damage your soul, and here's the old lady just sitting there having a good time. This is a nice chair. That's totally.
She's only allowed a cup of coffee left.
Yes. I think there's a resemblance of that old lady to the Queen too. By the way, of course, that was when she was much younger. She's what, 99 now? I don't know.
I don't know how old she is.
I just read that the Queen is the most popular government official in the world.
Yeah, the English love her.
I couldn't believe how beautifully she floated down for the Olympics in the parachute, right into the.
That happened? I didn't see that.
Wait, what?
You didn't see the
No.
Queen
No.
parachute down into the stadium?
Absolutely
How
not.
could I have missed this?
You're wearing like an Evel Knievel jumpsuit.
We have to watch the ad. What?
Oh, this is the whole thing.
That's great.
Now, happy and glorious.
This was set up by Boris Johnson.
Wine bottle opens itself.
parachute out of a helicopter, doesn't the propellers suck you up?
No. Gravity still works.
It's taking a lot longer than I remember.
It's not the Queen.
Yes, it is. You'll see. It's the Queen.
It's bullshit, dude. Cute. Good try.
With James Bond.
Yeah.
Starring Daniel Craig and Her Majesty the Queen.
They wouldn't have lied to it.
Mesdames et messieurs, veuillez vous lever pour Sa Majesté la Reine et Son Altesse Royale, le Duc d'Édimbourg, accompagné par
Yeah, she totally looks like she just jumped out of a helicopter.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for Her Majesty the Queen and His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, accompanied by the President of the International Olympic Committee, Jacques Rod.
I can remember like when she was younger, she'd be like waving like this at the crowd. And the older she got a little slower. Then it just turned into the hand thing.
Constantly like,
And even that's really slow now. It's like,
I should mention some stuff by Voltaire, I guess.
you guys.
Why not? That's his nom de plume, his actual name, notice, is Francois-Marie Arouet, or however you would say that. Actually, this tells me that they don't actually pronounce the T, I suppose. The one I especially remember is Candide, which was his satire on Leibniz. And we talked about that, right? I showed you some footage, or whatever you call it, YouTube video. It's not footage anymore because you don't have film that's like a length. So it's all just digital. You can weigh it, see how much video is on there. And that's where he is an exemplar of a satire plus. So what else about Voltaire? All sorts of other things, but the sense that the church thought that the soul was what you had to protect, and that meant you have to basically make the body suffer. And it's a good thing for the body to suffer because it makes you stronger, right? It's not the way that Nietzsche will say that later. What makes you, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I don't, Nietzsche might have gotten that.
Clarkson.
Pardon?
Nothing, carry on. It doesn't matter.
Okay, but he might have gotten that from the same source, but it's not exactly what Nietzsche will argue for out of that. But what Rousseau does is flips this whole Christianity thing on its head and argues that the church should care about the happiness of the individual. That what's important is caring for the body. With all the wealth the church has, what it should be doing with that is spending it on the poor to improve the lot of the poor. If you showed caritas, which is love, for the people of the church, that should also be charity, right? It's kind of confusing, as we say charity, it comes from caritas, which is love, and you know, the way that the church would show love for the members of the church is by caring for their soul, you know, by starving you, fasting you, you know, because that's good for your soul. And even when the Pope, this was Pope John Paul II, gave a lecture, they call it a lecture, a sermon, in the Philippines, as I recall. Might have been Manila, I don't know where it was. But he went there and he gave a sermon, and there was, I think, like 1 million people or something that went to this. And the main point of his sermon was to put your faith in Jesus and understand that the suffering you experience is God's design. This, you know, so don't bemoan your lot. It's all good for you that you're suffering this way, because that will mean you're going to have a wonderful paradise, you know, at the end of life when you die.
They always fall back on that.
Yeah, I suppose it could even be like a Spanish thing, you know. What's the Dias des Muertes or whatever it is, the Day of Death, right? There's even a new movie, relatively new, about a kid. I think, didn't Disney even make the movie?
Are you talking about
Coco?
Yeah.
Coco? Yeah, right? You know, the day of, you know, where he's, because of whatever, he ends up visiting the world of the dead, and I guess he goes to see his grandfather or something. I didn't see the movie. I played the game, though, the 3D thing. So that doesn't really tell you everything about the movie, but it gives you, it's really fascinating because you get to put on clothes. So I was, you know, I had a hat. You know, I was a skeleton, you know, which was funny because you could see your hands and you're a skeleton, you know, because you're dead. So there's a focus on death and how wonderful death can be for us. You know, you get to play guitars, sing, you know, funny songs, and you have to be careful though the dead dogs that also grab your bones and run off with them. You know, so so the focus is on death. You know, and so being prepared for death, and not how to improve our conditions here and now. And a lot of criticism was voiced at the Pope for doing that, because, you know, I remember reading, you know, people saying, you know, how dare he go there and tell people they should be happy with their misery? You know, and I'm thinking, well, but that's the way the church always has been, is focused on that, right? You know, so not using money in order to, you know, have, you know, a happier life. The goal is, you know, to avoid being attached to the physical pleasures. But Rousseau gives us the argument that that's what the church should be focused on, is improving the lives of the members of the church, instead of taking all their wealth and using it to build beautiful palaces of gold, where the celebration of the Mass is held, etc. You know, all
and
the
collect the wealth, you know, of antiquities. And
instead the church should spend its money on the poor.
Yeah.
Well, there was always an aspect of, you know, the church funds would help those with the least, but it wasn't anything like today. And in a sense, the kind of charities that we have today are more a reflection of Rousseau's thinking. But again, notice, this is just the opposite of what everyone knows to be true. I mean, you're looking at over 1,000-year history of belief that, you know, suffering is our natural state in life. Now that's relegated to C-3PO in Star Wars, you know, where he's in the desert. You know, we're made to suffer. You know, that's our lot in life. You know, That's it used to be everybody's situation, but now it's just the robot. So enjoy, look at Rousseau and interpret everything he does basically as this
Like a
technique
shock
of
jock of his day.
just saying just the opposite of what everyone knows to be the case, becoming famous for it.
But
He'd have had a podcast for sure.
he was trying to,
Yeah.
in his works, he was trying to help people. Unlike some people that are doing the complete opposite of that. They're not trying to help people, they're
Well,
trying to help themselves.
it is a revolution in thinking that way, though, because they didn't have that attitude before. So it's really quite revolutionary, right? And the French Revolution, of course, is going to have a tremendous impact on the world. It becomes the Napoleon Code, which is not really Rousseau, but Napoleon is focused on equality, fraternity, liberté, right? So the three, I wore the red, the blue, I figured the white shirt, they give me the tricolor, the liberty. I don't know which colors go with which, but fraternity and equality, right? So you get that. Remember that's 1789, and all men are created equal. We get in our Declaration, thanks to Jefferson. But the question of what the equality, of course, means is very, very different.
Equal to what?
Well, in U.S. law, of course, it's evolved.
Yeah.
So there have been lots of changes, and we might say that we call this progress. You certainly only call it progress if you're not conservative, right? But the idea, of course, initially is that they're legally equal in the contract if you belong in the contract. So you have to be an actual member. That basically means a wealthy male Caucasian farm owner, from Virginia.
Yeah.
So it's pretty clear
Virginian
that Jefferson is
standing.
thinking people like me
Yeah.
are created equal, and they're
So
talking.
other people like me.
Yeah, and they're talking about George. The king shouldn't have the right to rule us, except for where we've given him the rights and privileges because of his requirements. He owes us. Whoa, that's very revolutionary.
Well, let's get mad about it and start a corporation.
But when you look at Rousseau, the kind of equality that comes out of that, whether Rousseau realized the can of worms or whatever you want to call it, and the can of pineapple, that he opened for everyone, was that everyone should get the same kind of rewards, right? So when we talk about justice, we talk about distributive justice. How do you distribute the benefits of our economy so that everyone gets a fair share, right? That's different than retributive justice. Retributive justice is how you punish people for doing bad things. You get their retribution, right? But distributive justice is concerned with how the pie is shared among all of the, so if you have 100 people, you don't share the pie in such a way that 2 or 3 people get all the pieces and the rest of you suck in, right? Basically, you have to try to slice the pie up so that everyone will starve, or not, right? It depends on the rules you set up, who obviously is going to set up the rules, and so on. But Napoleon picks this up, and you end up now with a very different kind of society, which really transforms your, at least where Napoleon takes the revolution and spreads it. So
We kind of formed a people's army, didn't he?
absolutely, but also he redistributed property and stuff.
Well, wasn't that how he paid them? I mean,
Well, that was something that.
because I mean, and a big part of his finances was Louisiana too.
He got that money, but yes, he actually allowed his military, as the people took over places, to basically harvest whatever was in the area, as far as I understand it.
It's pretty classic.
And the Russians frustrated that, of course, by destroying everything.
Well, right, because the
as they
loot was a
retreated.
big part of how he was going to pay for the campaign, I think, right?
Oh, yeah, it was a pay-as-you-go deal,
Yeah,
and it didn't work. And Hitler made the same mistake.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
that-
because he pretty much did the same thing, because he stole all those tanks from Czechoslovakia.
well, and he was trying to get to the harvest.
in the
Feed-
Ukraine, yeah.
Yeah, and the farmers hid it, and his men couldn't find it. But then when the Russians came back, they were better at finding where the farmers hid
Right.
it.
They had.
And they killed the farmers.
Right,
You know,
yeah.
so, yeah, that Stalin had, you know, a set of priorities. And
Well, 'cause there was a
Hitler
post-war
had a set of
famine, too.
priorities. For Hitler, the people that would not die from starvation because of Churchill, basically
the blockade.
blockading continental Europe so that they couldn't.
So is
get
that
any
basically
food.
just forced them east for food then, more or less?
Right. The committee told Hitler that they expected at least 21 million people to die of starvation.
If they didn't invade the Soviet Union, basically.
Well, they didn't say. As far as I know, the committee didn't say we need to do this.
Well, no, but I mean,
We-
like that's what
He said,
obviously what his
how
thinking.
much food we're
Yeah.
able to make from the territory we have
Right.
will mean that roughly 21 million people are going to die of starvation. And Hitler decided, well, it's not going to be Germans. So he prioritized people and basically said the war policy. By the way, the fascinating book on that is The Taste of War. Absolutely fascinating.
So 1940 then was basically Germany trying to starve out Britain, and then Britain flipped it on them and starved them out.
Churchill even wasn't going to feed the Greeks who were on their side because he was afraid some of the food that they sent the Greeks
Would end
might
up
have
with-
gotten to the Germans. So yeah,
Because that's what you read about, like battle after battle on the Eastern Front.
you
the
read,
Germans
you
surrendered
read this
because
and
they
you
ran
think,
out of
wow,
food.
Hitler and Churchill had a lot in common. They were both bastards.
Right. Yeah.
And Stalin too. You know, so you know they're all
Yeah, there's
basically
nobody that really
fighting
comes
over
out
food,
looking that awesome.
trying to figure out how to feed their priorities.
How are we going to starve the other side?
Stalin's priority was the army and the urban people who were supplying the army with arms,
The rail
and
lines.
then the farmers.
Yeah.
So the farmers, you know, go in, steal all their food, kill them.
Well, that was always kind of
Kulaks.
Soviet policy. I mean, after the new economic policy.
But the czars, I remember reading John Quincy Adams.
Wasn't he one of the first ambassadors?
He was the first
Okay, yeah.
ambassador. 18 years old. His father sent him. Well, it wasn't just his father, but
Right.
sent him as the ambassador to the Moscow court, which was at the time Catherine the Great. And as he was being taken there by wagon through dirt roads, so this is a hellacious way to travel across Eastern Europe. As he was traveling, he realized, you know, Poland looks terrible, Ukraine looks terrible, but by the time you got to Russia, wow, it really looked nicer. You know, so That's kind of interesting,
Hmm.
you know, that we don't think of it that way.
But wasn't Poland part of Russia then?
No.
Really?
Poland was,
Because I thought they'd already split them up between Austria-Hungary and the
well,
Prussians.
it depends on when we're thinking, there were occasions when Poland actually
Well, no, because that would have been
didn't
before
have anyone in charge
1812,
of
wouldn't
it,
it?
but it was Gustav of Sweden had come down and actually had taken Poland for a while. So I'd have to go back and read Michener's Poland, because you know, the chapters were from the east, from the west, from the north, from the south. So it was, you know, Poland's always being occupied.
Right, yeah. Well, I mean, it's like too flat.
Pola means field.
Yeah.
So it's a nice big flat area where the armies could come in and just, you know, take over, like a lawnmower, I suppose. Yeah, fascinating book if you get the chance. Totally revises your kind of propagandized view of World War II and how evil Hitler was.
Well, it seems like it was a lot more piecemeal than the history wants to throw at you. Like, there was some grand design, and it was like, nah, they were just kind of doing everything as it came up, a lot of it. I mean, the evil part of it was, like, they're all along, but
Well,
as
I
far
mean,
as, like,
you
what
might,
they did.
you know, you might make this argument, and it's not that it's clearly the case, but certainly hinted at in the book, that had Churchill not put the squeeze on Hitler because he didn't want
He might not
Hitler
win
to be
east.
the competition with him,
Yeah.
or with England, for the world empire, right? And Germany could easily have done that if it had taken over Europe and further.
Well, it had time to build a navy after and all that.
The Bismarck was the most powerful battleship at the time.
He had a short life.
Well, that's because the British were absolutely horrified at it and did everything they could to blow it up, including blowing up a lot of their own vessels in the
Well, they
process.
blew up all of the dry docks in France and stuff too, didn't they?
Oh yeah, they were
Because they didn't want them to have any shipbuilding capacity on the Atlantic coast.
right. It was clear empire versus empire,
Right, yeah. 'Cause
and Churchill, thanks to persuading the U.S. to come in, ended up winning.
Well, because it doesn't seem like Britain was ever under serious invasion threat. Like, it seems like they were
that was
mostly
because
trying
Hitler
to...
didn't really want to invade them. He still thought of
It's a
them
teeny
as
tiny island, but
well. He still thought of them as more alike. I mean, there was close ties between England
Correct.
and Germany.
Well, that, I mean, it's kind of like
There was no threat of
us invading
invasion.
Japan. I mean, like, invading an island and occupying it at the same time. It's like, not really...
There
Is this
would have
fun? Are we
been
having a
way
good
more
discussion?
lives.
Anyway,
It's
it's
still-
kind of
it's
like...
still-
Yeah.
they still starved them out though. Or at least that was their intent.
But if you get the chance, read this.
Oh, yeah, I'll check it out.
Quiz question, please.
Yeah.
I feel like I should ask something about Voltaire or Rousseau. Rousseau?
Sure.
Do you like his music? Yes.
That's so easy though. I want you to have to like look up something.
I don't even know. Oh, there you go.
What's your favorite Rousseau album?
We would have to listen to him.
Damn it.
Yeah, but that would be torturous.
Okay.
Even though I'm Roman Catholic, that's not really the kind of
What is
comfort
Rousseau most known
torture.
for?
So, I would say which of his works, Rousseau's works, do you find most interesting today? Which of his works do you find most interesting today?
Okay.
We have a pretty darn good list right here. A lot of these are very famous.
One.
have a good weekend,
You too.
And you as well.
which is French, you know.
Weekend.
Le weekend. Weekend. Yes.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
Don't know why.
Don't know. Well, probably
Prochain,
because
la prochaine fini, or what would you say? The end of the week.
I'm not sure.